pleasure to welcome award-winning author Hanna Pylväinen to Concordia this evening. A graduate of Mount Holyoke College, she received her MFA from the University of Michigan, where she was also a postgraduate Zell Fellow. She is the recipient of residencies at Gerasi, the MacDowell Colony, and Yaddo, as well as a fellowship at the Fine Arts Work Center in Provincetown, Massachusetts. Most recently, she is the recipient of the 2013 Balkans Fiction Prize, which recognizes outstanding work in literary merit, and the 2012 Whiting Writers Award, which is awarded not for a specific work, but for the abundant promise of future work. It's a lot of pressure. Her writing has appeared in Harper's Magazine, the New York Times Magazine, the Wall Street Journal, and the Chicago Tribune. She's just back from Seattle, where I had the pleasure of hearing her speak at the AWP conference. Published by Henry Holt in August of 2012, We Sinners is the story of a large family that belongs to a small religious sect in modern Michigan, and how each character struggles to find his place within and outside family and faith. The Chicago Tribune hailed it as a magical work of imagination. USA Today said this moving story offers grace, insight, and compassion. And Library Journal proclaimed it a remarkably sensitive family portrayal, a powerful and unforgettable debut. And as the seventh child of 9, I would add, I found her characters compelling and real. In an interview with Fiction Writers Review, Hanna remarked, "One of the things you realize in really big families, which is both shocking and not shocking, is that everyone is his own person. You may have come from the same family, slept in the same beds, and eaten the same food, and had the same piano lessons, but as much as you want to believe that you are the same, there's a certain inherent falseness to that. We're all utterly different." And I think she captures the truth remarkably in her fiction, revealing her characters' unique personalities with honesty and compassion. Please join me in welcoming her to the stage.
Thank you so much, Ellen. I did not know you also came from a large family. But that actually brings up one of the things I want to talk about tonight, which is the question of whether or not the particular can illuminate the general, whether or not writing about such a small and strange community can have interest to those who don't come from such a community. So that's a nice lead in here. But I also want to thank all of you for coming. I know it is completely freezing and it feels all the more painful because we were given a brief respite from it. And it's always worse when it follows a period of relief. So let's hope it comes again soon. So one of the things I wanted to talk about tonight is a question of fact and fiction. And I wanted to talk about this in a slightly more informal fashion. So I hope you'll forgive my own lack of formality here. And please, I just want to say right now, if you happen to have questions, since we are a smaller group tonight, and it's a more intimate setting, feel free to raise your hand and stop me if I'm saying something that you would like to know more about. Although I will open up for a more general Q&A at the end. So as Ellen was saying, and as I'm hoping to talk about tonight, my book, We Sinners, is about a fundamentalist Finnish community, which most people do not even know is a thing. Although in my own personal experience, you can take the word fundamentalist, add any other country to it, and it's probably a thing. And as many people ask, and as some of my publicity over the time has made clear, I am from this background, which I think is both important and astoundingly unimportant, and I want to talk about why that is. Whenever you write something which others suspect to be true, you run into several interesting problems as a writer. One, that you have the uncomfortable feeling that all of your readers are wondering which character is really you, which things really happened to you. Perhaps, and I'm going to step aside from my own story right now. I was once discussing this with another wonderful writer, actually a National Book Award winner, and she said, you know, people still come up to me and say, "I'm so sorry to hear that your mother passed away." And her mother is very alive and well, which goes to show you this particular problem, which I think is both a wonderfully human problem. I don't think it's necessarily bad, and I think it tends to happen, I think, especially with living writers. We're not as interested now anymore in whether or not Levin and Anna Karenina is really Tolstoy, although we often suspect that. And we stop asking those particular questions, usually after enough time has passed. But I bring this up because Ellen and I were speaking in the car on the way here briefly about the fact that we're both from Seven Sister Schools. And I, as a graduate of Mount Holyoke College, first began my writing there, and I don't think this is incidental. Many writers have a kind of narrative of growing up knowing that they're a writer. They often have stories. Oh, when I was little, my mother told me I was always telling stories. You hear that a lot. I always wrote in journals. I always kept a diary. I did absolutely none of those things. My mother has never shared a single story, implying that I should have ever shown any promise whatsoever in writing. And one of the interesting things about that is that it was while I was at Mount Holyoke, I was actually studying chemistry and neuroscience primarily, and I happened to take a short story class, which I was not supposed to be in because I had not taken Creative Writing 101. And the professor let me into the course anyway, after I'd submitted a brief sample I wrote for her the night before. And at the end of the class, she came and set me aside and said, what's your major? And I had told her chemistry. And she said, no, it's English, and you're going to write a creative writing thesis, and you're going to write it with me. And for that creative writing thesis, I wrote a memoir. And I remember at the time feeling it was very terrible to be 21 or 22 and write a memoir. There seemed something really awful and embarrassing about that. Like, wait till you're older and you have something to say. But one of the things that did for me is by the time I went to Michigan, by the time I knew that I did not have interest in publishing a memoir, that I was not as interested in the arc of nonfiction, that I really had to figure out how to take some of these emotional truths that I was really interested in and bring them into the world of fiction. But the other thing I realized was that because of the almost sensationalist background of my youth, people almost didn't want it to be fiction. I think truly the book would sell better if it was nonfiction, if I talked more about my own family. And so there's a real pressure that gets put on a writer, and especially, I believe, a woman writer, to speak about her past and to point to the things that are true and the things that are not true. And one of the things that's been interesting to me in the process of having published, and the process now of doing various interviews, is that there's often a refusal from the interviewer for me to escape without talking about my own family. I often hear questions: what does your family think about this? How does your mother feel? Which character is most like you? And I don't necessarily have a problem with that if they ask that question to male writers. And so I think it's something that is natural, but also at the same time can imply a lack of invention on the writer's part, which can at some point feel inherently insulting. And I say this only because when you write a memoir and then you decide to write a fiction, you're quite aware of the difference between the two. And so what I want to talk about today is why I was more interested in fiction, how I thought about shaping these stories, how I thought about shaping the arc of the book, because there are real advantages to both genres, and there are real disadvantages. The main disadvantage of memoir, obviously, is that you don't get to play with what really happened. And often in life, things can be quite boring. People will die very slowly, for instance. It's much more dramatic if they die faster. Sorry. And we often have a tendency to want to maybe exaggerate a fight, exaggerate a tension. And in stories, of course, we like things to have our nice plot. We like to have a crisis. We like to have a denouement. And in real life, there's often no closure. But but also things can build very, very, very slowly, which can be frustrating for a reader. Or instead, the way in which you one day get a terrible phone call about something tragic that has happened in a story that can also feel unsatisfying. The reader will feel that the action has been unearned. And at the same time, the great advantage of memoir, of course, is the contract of truth, which is so interesting and particularly special to memoir. This idea that the writer is doing their absolute best to capture the essential truths of an experience. And I think that even if the reader knows that those experiences have been modulated by the writer's own biases, there's still a sense of you believing that they are trying their best to get at the truth. In fiction, you get to throw the truth away, which is lovely and liberating for some, for me. And one of the things that I found myself most interested in was this problem of knowing that I had this particular past, knowing that I had heard just some of the strangest and oddest stories my whole life, and seen some terrible and wonderful things happen, and wondering, can this translate to fiction? And one of the reasons I ask this in particular is there's a real dearth of books about religious communities which are not sensationalist exposés. In America, we love our sensationalist exposés. We love to read about the person who escaped and was liberated. I think it can, and I say this as someone who left this particular community. But it was also the reason that I wanted to take on the challenge of writing this, was because the story of the exposé, the interest in my background in my life as a writer, that particular cultural pressure felt less interesting to me, in part because it's not the difficult question behind conservative religion. Why people leave these communities is obvious and easy. Why people stay is much more complicated and much harder to get at. And if I had written a memoir, I would be telling the story of why I left, which is not very interesting. So one of the things I was trying to do in We Sinners was to solve a couple of particular problems. One, that I would ideally be writing for a mainstream audience that had no background in a small, incredibly small, fundamentalist community. Two, that I would have a much larger cast of characters than most writers have to deal with. There's a very good reason. Most novels only have, let's say, 2 to 5 main characters. And three, that I was writing a book which did not have an agenda, which was not trying to persuade the reader that leaving the church was good, or that staying was good, which was very hard to do. And actually, in fact, I found myself really trying to work against my own life in that way, trying to write against my own stories and my own biases, which of course are very real. I'm just a human. And so one of the things I found myself doing was leaning towards a structure in which each chapter could be told by a different character of the family, of one of these very large families. And so I made up a family, and I made up, quite a large number of children, 9. And I wanted each of the children to have a different relationship to the church and to have a different story to tell. And one of the things I wanted to do structurally was to show the ways in which all of these characters sort of fail to see one another. They each have their own viewpoint or their own relationship to God and the church. And just as like a small, for instance, one of the characters in the story, it has this secret boyfriend, and then later you hear in another chapter that someone refers to it as, oh, Tina's secret boyfriend, which clearly indicates it's not so secret. But I think the structure, one of the things I was trying to do with the structure was to allow the characters to talk to each other without talking to each other. One of the main tenets of this kind of Finnish community is that it's very Finnish, and one of the main tenets of being Finnish is being very private. And one of the main tenets of being very private is not speaking. And in fact, in workshop at my MFA at Michigan, I would often hear, your characters don't say anything to each other. Because usually there's always a push for more dialogue, more confrontation, more action. And so, in a way, to feel the discomfort of how these characters think about each other and the differences in their own opinion and their own beliefs allowed me to sort of have them confront each other without ever confronting each other in a more Finnish fashion. The other thing that writing fiction allowed me to do is it allowed me to be exponentially more honest, which no one ever believes unless you try writing both yourself. When you write memoir, you are protective inherently of yourself, of others, and you often try to carve out a slightly more convenient truth. And even if you're writing in what we often call a more confessional style, I often find that what happens is that it draws attention to the action, to the shock of a particular action. And I often find for myself as a writer, when I look back at my memoir, I think, wow, that's a lot of lies. And I found that in fiction, I was becoming much more honest because I was free. And I don't mean that in terms of creating a character, changing its name from someone I know in real life and calling that freedom. What I mean is the ability to talk about certain events, to create certain events that allow the reader to recapture the emotion of that action along with the character. It's the difference between reading, let's say, a tabloid story about some shocking thing someone did, where your interest is simply in the action and the fact that a particular sin was committed. But I think one of the wonderful things fiction can do for us is allow us to commit a sin along with a character, to feel what that particular sin or that particular mistake is like. So, on that note, I wanted to read a little bit from my work, and one of the things that I wanted to sort of draw your attention to here are, as I was talking about before, the sort of lack of dialogue, and also how the characters don't communicate to each other. It was one of my biggest struggles as a writer on a more sentence level, was trying to use the close third point of view to maximize a sense of internal monologue without having to write many first persons, which can be very disorienting. If every chapter is written as I, then we'll never figure out who's who. And maybe you're understanding now, I'm not sure how many of you here write or don't write, but how much writing is a bit of a game. So I'm going to read tonight I'm going to read one of the shorter chapters in the book, because I always think at readings it's nice to hear the whole thing. That's maybe my own preference, but this is from one of the shorter chapters. This is from perspective of one of the younger daughters at the time, named Lena. And if you read the rest of the book, she does appear later in a horribly shocking way, which is hopefully for some readers part of the joy of reading. This chapter is called Keepers. Her plan had been to clean in the middle of the night, so her mother would wake to an empty kitchen sink. But as she stood in the foyer, the bathroom fan beating loudly and uselessly, the mess before her made her want to cry. Being in a family of 11 made her want to cry. The way someone had soaked up the dog's pee but not thrown away the paper towel. The way that responsibility divided by 11 meant no one was really responsible. Carefully, she threw away the peed-on paper towel, the banana browning in a lunch bag. She stacked backpacks. She sorted shoes in the shoe bin, and she was sweeping up a mound of dirt when she heard a car door close and turned to see Tina walking toward the house. She looked at the clock. It was 4:45 in the morning. Tina opened the door and stared at Lena, at the pile of dirt. She brushed the snow off her shoulders, off her hair, then headed up to their room, leaving a watery trail. When Lena heard her mom's feet in the hallway, she hadn't finished the kitchen. Her mom appeared in her pantyhose and a blouse and watched her scrape a film of jam from the counter. "It looks like an elf came last night," her mom said brightly, pinching her butt. "Go wake the big girls, will you?" she said, heading to the bathroom to blow-dry her hair. Lena went up to her room. The big girls lay immovable in their beds. Tina's clothes were piled on the floor. When she pushed at Tina's shoulder, she rolled over, naked, and Lena tried not to stare at the slump of her breasts. "Shit," Tina said, opening her eyes angrily. "Everything is just shit today." On the highway, her mom passed back a hairbrush and Tina pulled at her hair, flicking water from her shower. "How come I'm not blonde like everyone else?" she said. "How come I'm fat?" Her mom snapped that it was a sin to talk that way. All of her children were beautiful. "What's that?" her father said. He was almost deaf in his right ear. Lena looked out the window at people in smaller vans heading to larger churches. Churches with steeples and stained glass windows, where people rose and knelt and dipped their fingers into bowls of water. She watched her mother reach out and smooth one of her father's carefully trimmed curls. He reached his hand out and she took it, and the rest of the ride they held hands, straight into the church parking lot, her father spinning the wheel with the palm of his left hand. At church, the organist was late, and they asked Tina to play. Lena watched her walk to the bench, searching for signs of hesitation, signs of guilt about wherever she'd been last night. But Tina's face was smooth, and when she played, her toes slipped confidently over the pedals. During the last verse, her dad rose and Lena heard his bad knee cracking up the aisle. Her dad cleared his throat. "In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Ghost," he said. Lena folded her hands, right thumb over left, the same way her dad did, which he had said once was less common, a sign that Lena must like order in the world, which was probably true. In the middle of the sermon, Tina unfolded a note, not meaning for Lena to read it, but Lena saw it. "Did he really call your thing a pussy?" The word pussy was underlined like something proud and important. Tina folded the note back up quickly. Lena felt herself flush just reading it. How did Tina do it? How did she just sit there, she wondered. She studied Tina's nails, looking for flecks of polish, but she didn't see any. "Stop doing this to Mom and Dad," she wanted to say to Tina. "They can't take it." Tina didn't see how Mom had cried when she had run off with the car. She didn't see how Dad sat on the couch with the Bible late into the night, waiting for her to come home. Tina didn't pay the price of her own antics. The little kids did. Sometimes her mom said Tina would grow out of it. Lena didn't know if this was really true. But Tina's heart could be softened, Lena knew. Once Lena had been taking a sauna, and she heard her dad come downstairs and start ironing his shirt, and a few minutes later Tina had followed. The way her dad had built the sauna in the basement, she could hear everything through the vent, and Lena had stopped pouring water on the rocks so she could listen. They were talking softly, but Lena knew, the whole house knew, that her dad had forbidden Tina to go hear the famous violinist play the Sibelius. "Do you know," Tina had screamed, "I am the only violinist in the country who is being forbidden to hear the very piece they are working on." And she had threatened to throw her violin, but of course she never would. She loved it too much. For several minutes now, there was only the sound of the iron, its hard hiss, its soft song. Then Tina had begun to cry, and there was the sound of her leaning or crumpling against the washer, and her dad must have set the iron down and walked over to her. He forgave her. He said he loved her. "I love you," he had said, and Lena had let the words be for her too. She knew how hard it was for him to say these things. "I love you too, Dad," she had thought from the bench. "I love you, Tina." Really, it was almost a relief to hear him speak in his sermons. She could not recall a single conversation with him that was as long as one of his sermons. And so when he spoke, she listened intently, as if trying to memorize what he sounded like when he talked. But he was always so serious in his sermons, always deep in the recesses of some troubled emotion. What was it like, she wondered, to minister to your own children? What did they look like to him from up there? Did he know things? Had he heard Tina sneaking out? Did he try to say the things that would reach her? He tried so hard. Once she had watched him icing the backyard so they could skate. For night upon night he had stood out with the hose in his big Coleman boots, just thickening and thickening the ice. "Why is Dad like that?" she had asked her mom. "Aren't you glad I married him?" was all her mother had said. "Sometimes our trials are personal ones," her father was saying. "I know for myself," he said. "I never see my sister anymore, who, as many of you know, long ago chose the world over the flock of the believers." Lena was listening now, and she could tell everyone was, even Tina. Her parents never spoke about their past. "Even when I called my father," he went on, "to tell him I had repented, that I had received this most precious gift of faith, that was the last conversation we had for some years." He looked down at his hands and for a few tense moments did not look up or speak. Then he said that sometimes he missed his family, that only a few days ago he had called his sister, and he had spoken to her about the word and how he could forgive her for even that great sin of unbelief. But she didn't want to hear it. "That's how unbelievers are," he said. "The word makes them so uncomfortable they can't stand to hear it. That's its power," he said. "So great is its power." Somewhere in the back of the congregation, someone lifted their hand. "Believe all of your sins forgiven in Jesus' name and precious blood," her dad said. And then a few more hands went up, and he had to say it again and again. "Believe all of your sins forgiven, all sins forgiven." The words becoming more and more mumbled, more and more important. And she saw how he looked at each person, raised his hand up toward each hand. She felt struck suddenly by the need for him to see her, to see his own children, to forgive her, or maybe them. And for the first time in her life, Lena raised her own hand. She saw his surprise. But he said the words to her like to anyone else, and her face grew hot with the attention, and she crept her hand back down. She half wanted to turn and say something to Tina, to see if the proximity of the absolution had made her feel something, but Tina only took a gum wrapper and folded it into a tiny hat in a still smaller boat. Even during communion, when her dad read the liturgy, Tina looked bored. "Verily, verily, verily, I say unto you," her dad read, "and together with the thief on the cross." Lena loved that, "and together with the thief." Most of all, Lena loved, "Whatsoever thou shalt bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatsoever thou shalt loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven." Sins being loosed and let go and gone, all of them keepers and loosers of one another's sins. But Tina chewed another piece of gum, folded another boat. When communion started, Lena watched her mother kneel at the altar, the back of her shoes thin and dirty. She watched her dad as he held out the wafer. The big girls rose to get in line for communion, and at first Lena was relieved that Tina would have to at least face that hypocrisy, but then Tina turned and walked back up the aisle and out the sanctuary door. Lena looked around. She got up and walked slowly, as if nothing important was happening, and she went down to the basement, where she checked the bathroom for Tina, but there were the only two Warnemi girls playing with the faucets. In the nursing room, there were 4 mothers with cloths over their shoulders. She wound up at the back steps and opened the back door to the outside as quietly as she could, wondering if her dad could hear the door's tired squeal from where he stood, feeding her sisters the wafers. Outside, the snow was damp on her arms and the churchyard looked empty. The bush out front, which had made small berries that they popped in spring, had only thorns left. And though each spot in the parking lot was full, there was no one around, like a graveyard, the cars markers of people, but not the actual people. She walked to their van and opened the door. It was where she would go, the only private place. And looking in, she saw the tip of one of Tina's shoes hanging off the back seat. She got in and shut the door. "Get out," Tina said. "Please." She was talking into the seat and her voice was muffled. Lena dug below the bench and pulled out a sleeping bag. It smelled a little bit like pee, but she threw it over Tina. "Little Lena," Tina said at last, "you're too sweet." "You want to know something?" Tina said. Tina sat up and swung her leg over the bench. She climbed next to Lena. She pulled the sleeping bag over their chests. She considered Lena carefully. "Okay," Tina said. "He's not from the church." "Oh," Lena said. "He's cute," Tina said, "I promise." "An unbeliever," Lena said. "Well, yeah," Tina said, and she smiled like Lena had pointed out something new and wonderful. "Don't worry, okay?" she said. "Are you going to ask?" Lena said. Tina took her hand, and Lena had the sensation of being very small and on the beach, their mother calling, "Take your buddy's hand, everyone take your buddy's hand, don't lose your buddy." Minutes passed and the snow thickened. "I'm cold," Lena said. As if bidden, the front door of the church opened and their father appeared. He wasn't wearing a coat. His tie wavered with the falling snow and he was looking their way. "Quick," Tina said. She threw herself to the floor of the van, pulled the sleeping bag over her. "Come on," she said. Lena lay flat on the bench. They heard the sounds of footsteps approaching, the sound of the van door opening. "Are you actually hiding?" her dad said. "Get up, get out of there. It's freezing, get inside." He began to walk away. Still on the floor, Tina curled her legs into her chest. "Just go," she said. "Just come," Lena said from the bench. But neither of them moved. The van door stayed open, and the snow fell, and the wind blew falling snow into the van and onto Tina's hair. For many seconds, the snow did not melt. Lena was so cold she rubbed her legs together, but still she did not leave, wanting only to be kind, and feeling that waiting was the only kindness left. Thank you. So I think now I'll just open up to a general Q&A. I don't know if anyone has any questions about anything I've said or anything I've read, but I'm certainly happy to answer anything. I actually left the church during my time at Mount Holyoke, and I think my memoir was partially inspired by that.
I love the image of everybody's holding hands. And it says speaks so many volumes. The image come to you and then you realize the emotional impact of it. It's just such a simple thing, but it expresses so much.
That's really tough. So I think whenever I write, I sort of think of it as like a culling process. So I tend to write very quick, fast first drafts, which are very long, and then I cut. And usually what ends up happening is I'll sort of realize that there are certain sentences or images that even if I cut them from something else, they're so good I really don't want to lose them. So that was actually one of those moments which came from a very different chapter which ultimately did not appear in this book. And I think partially, I've actually always been very interested in the idea of siblings holding hands. It doesn't happen so much anymore. But I remember, for instance, when I was younger, and I remember my brother stopped holding our hands because it was too embarrassing to hold hands with his sisters, and it just made me terribly sad. Like, oh no, now we're that old. or now he's that old. So I think that there's always something. I mean, one of the reasons I'm very interested actually in the family dynamic is we read often much more about the romantic dynamic. And so I think there's something about familial physical closeness, which I think has a lot more room to be explored. It's not written about terribly often, I don't find. But I think that, for many of those, I know for myself, coming from a large family, to be able to, sit next to your sister, and to be able to, to like have some part of you touching her, to hold her hand or something, is very strange. You're not, we don't do that normally. But it's like one of the great freedoms, I think, of being small and being in a family.
What I just loved is something you alluded to, the fact that I didn't make it easy for the reader to choose sides. Is it good or bad to be in this church, in this sect, and are we in fact rooting or not rooting for this child or that child, because you have multiple characters, to leave the church? And I'm not sure I have a question here, but if you could talk more about how you decided to make it less judgmental, and if your religion, I guess, second part, is compared to other churches that are intensely fundamental that do tend to get a lot of press. And I'm also just very interested in the church itself. So go ahead.
No, it's completely fine. I think I understand where you're going with that. So when I thought about writing about this particular community, as I was mentioning, it actually came, I think, during my time at Mount Holyoke, where a good number of my friends, and I don't say this disparagingly, really lovely people I'm still in touch with, but they were, for the most part, liberal and atheist. And because I arrived to college, still a believer of this community, by the time I left, they often treated it as this very wonderful thing that had happened to me, where I was free like them, and I could do things with them without feeling guilty. I could go to parties. They were very excited for me to get earrings, that kind of thing. And I myself was experiencing one of the greatest mornings of my life. And I felt that there was something missing in my ability to explain to them what was lost. And I felt it wasn't enough to say, oh yes, I used to see these people every Sunday for the first 20 years of my life, and now I might never see them again. And that really was what made me want to write a book. Toni Morrison once said that she wrote The Bluest Eye because she wanted to read it. And I'd always been a very big reader growing up, and I remember thinking, where is this story? I was really curious in writing a story in which a reader could begin to contemplate the sense of loss that people can experience when they leave communities. And I think any kind of community. And the other thing I felt was, to go to the second part of your question about other fundamentalist communities and their similarities or differences, especially since publishing, but even before, I've spoken with many people from many types of communities, Mormons, Hasids, the Amish, and there's also, as you might imagine, about 1,000 other very small sects or synods we've all probably never heard of. And one of the things that strikes me is often their rules are a little bit different and the restrictions are different, but some of that shared feeling is the same. And even when I was in high school, I used to feel very close to the Muslim girls. And I would see them in the bathroom arranging their scarves and worrying that one of the boys walking by would be able to see them arranging their scarves when the door was opened into the hallway. And I never felt comfortable enough to say it to them because I realized to them I just looked like someone else at high school. But I always wanted to say, I know you. I understand you. We are the same. And of course, we weren't the same, but I was living with very similar restrictions and worries. I also couldn't date anyone at school. I also felt I was like an outcast and an outsider. You know, I couldn't go to parties, that kind of thing. So I think one of the things I became interested in when I wrote this book was how to put the reader in what I sort of see as like ultimately the human problems of being a part of any community. And one of the things I was very interested in was actually trying to make the book less about the sort of details or the restrictions of the church and more about the human problems that come. So one of the things that always interests me is if you talk to anyone from any community, they're still thinking about which guy is cute or which girl is cute. They're still worrying because their father is depressed. They're still wondering, I'm trying to think of a good example, who's going to take the dog out. So I think like ultimately I'm much more interested in what makes people the same over what makes them different. And I was really trying to highlight as much as possible some of these emotions, which I think, or I hope, a general reader can also experience. So in the particular chapter I was just reading, Keepers, with Lena, like one of the things I found myself when I was writing it is like thinking, oh, Tina, you're so terrible. What are you doing? Get it together. And I think I also had just enormous sympathy for Lena, and I could really feel her desire for Tina to stay in the church. And so I think when I was writing, I really was trying to make that effort to myself feel those emotions again that I used to have.
That's the segue to my question. How did you cope with your own emotions as you were writing this book? Because apparently you are very close to their experience. It must have been extremely difficult for you.
So I think the act of invention, the act of the fiction, would sometimes feel a little bit like a game to me. I mean, I've always really enjoyed puzzles and codes and and there was something about writing fiction, making a plot line work, discovering an ending you didn't know was there originally. And I think that made writing this book feel different, for instance, from writing my memoir, which was complete anguish all the way through. At the same time, I did find myself often experiencing emotions along with my characters sometimes. It would vary a lot, but I think I especially experienced strong emotions when my characters surprised me, but meaning when they started to do things I felt I hadn't deliberately plotted or outlined before the writing of it. And there would be moments when I would just think, oh, how sad. And the funny thing is that one of my friends finished reading the book and she said to me, oh, I had no idea you were so lonely. Which I thought was very interesting because I think when I wrote it, I didn't really think about how many of the characters struggle with loneliness or a sense of being alone in a world of a large family or these communities. And I thought, yes, I think that's true. And I think I hadn't really realized that I had put that emotion so clearly out there. Because I do think that even in fiction, of course, I think what's revealed is the author's mind, the way the author thinks and feels more than anything else, more than the actual facts. So I think that in terms of sort of handling some of those emotions, I mean, I really think that fiction was what what freed me.
How did you get to an East Coast college? And was that an atypical trajectory or not?
I originally attended Mount Holyoke College because it was all women's, because my parents made the terrible mistake of thinking that that would be a safe bastion. But no, it was not a typical trajectory. I mean, and I think, part of the reason, even now, I often, try to credit my own education at Mount Holyoke was in part because that was where I first began to write. And as I was talking about before, as never having seen myself as a writer, I really feel like Mount Holyoke was the place that sort of let me see that as a possible career path, because before I'd been very, very, I was more interested in more traditional careers, like feeling very secure and having like a financially secure life was very important to me. And as we all know, being a writer is not a traditionally stable career.
I'm not sure if I'm asking the wrong question here because I had no background. This is the first time I'm hearing about this. What is your relationship with your family at this time?
My relationship with my family is not something I talk about. I mean, they are wonderful people. They remain wonderful people.
Do you think a smaller family would have changed that situation? Would have been easier for you?
In what way?
Just in growing up in a family that was not quite as big as the one that you experienced.
Well, I think that, growing up with a large family certainly keeps you very busy. It keeps you very entertained at all times. The neighbors from other smaller families were always over at our house because that was where all the interesting things were happening. It feels very difficult, of course, to imagine growing up in a smaller family. But I think now one of the things that I think about is, especially as a writer, is how much it gave me in terms of my ability to, I think, have sympathetic emotions for the state of others. How much it taught me to worry first about other people and what they think. Not that you wouldn't feel that way necessarily if you were an only child, but that certainly is the effect it had on me. And I think in part, I always have been someone who, I can't even believe I'm going to give this as an example, but I will, sort of look at people on subways and, really imagine their past, but also going so far as to, even if you are walking in like a main thoroughfare and there's like that one store no one's going into, I'm always the person who goes in because I feel bad. But to return to your question, I mean, I think certainly it would have been simpler. It would have been, financially easier. And I think one of the things that interests me in this particular community, and I think in a lot of conservative communities, is that as time goes on, I think it becomes more and more difficult for these communities to survive and to fit in the sense that, many people will come up to me and say, oh, well, my mother was from a large family, or my grandmother was. And it's becoming more and more rare, in part because, of course, it's becoming more and more difficult, financially especially. So I think that one of the things that interests me is that people continue to choose these communities despite the growing pressure. And I mean that not just financially, but also culturally, the way others perceive you can become more and more intense, I think, and I think it will continue to be.
I'm just curious, do you still keep in touch with the professor from Mount Holyoke who helps you find your voice?
Yes, I do. And she's been a wonderful, wonderful mentor for me. She's always been extremely encouraging. And I think one of the things that makes me more grateful now, of course, is being a writer can be a very hard and lonely life. And so it's it always strikes me that I'm tremendously lucky to have had such a wonderful professor, and I think, every writer, really needs that and really relies on the support of the writing community, to keep the faith, so to speak. Oh, no, thank you so much.